Today we've got a super fun variation for black with 82% win rate in the most commonly played line, and not only you win games, you'll make your opponents question their sanity. We start off with the Scandinavian Defense, but we don't stop here. We keep gambiting pawns, and after they take, you then play queen to c7. Now, by the way, this variation is for completely unhinged people, which is luckily the greatest part of the Igor nation. But after that, I'll also show you the alternative, a more normal variation for more solid people, and both of them are perfectly playable and really good. So anyway, after you play queen c7 and he keeps capturing your pawns, initially it looks like you're playing give up chess and you're giving up pawns for no reason. But the reality is it's a very tricky variation, and it allows you to grab the initiative and to start being aggressive straight from the beginning. It is actually quite a common situation. If you're playing black but you want to be aggressive, you have to give a bribe and kind of switch the situation around. Now you're kind of playing the Danish Gambit as white. Anyway, while playing knight f3, that's the most played move, you also develop. They play bishop e2, they understand that you're going to attack them, and that is why they try to play solid. You go knight f6, they castle, and here you go knight g4. Now your idea is very straightforward. You aim to play queen takes h2 mate, and that is why we wish our knight to be there. Now temporarily, this knight from f3 is guarding the pawn, but your idea is to play knight d4. If let's say white plays something, you then go knight d4, you distract this knight, we trade it off or distract it, and as soon as that happens, you play queen takes h2 mate. That is your plan. And sometimes it'll work out like that. But of course, in most cases, your opponents are going to play differently. They'll play pawn h3, trying to kick this knight away. But you then play pawn h5. And although it looks like some banzai attack where you're just hoping for some hope chess checkmate, but the reality is it's super tricky. As I mentioned earlier, in this particular position, black's got 82% win rate. And if Stockfish whispers anything different to your ear, do not listen to it. It does not understand chess, right? I mean, it understands it too well. It does not understand that in reality, it's super tricky to defend this situation. Now, your idea is still the same. You want to keep the knight right there, and then play knight d4, distract this knight, and play queen h2 mate. If white decides to trade here on g4, that would be a losing error already. After we recapture, now we've got this rook joining our attack. And therefore, the knight still cannot move away, because then queen h2 mate. But if the knight does not move, then you take it and play queen h2 mate. It's not easy for white to escape it. If they play pawn g3, you keep bringing brilliant moves, and you play knight to d4. That is really something. Now, this time we still put significant pressure to this knight. We're going to capture it, and if he accepts our sacrifice, then there is rook h1. Quite interestingly, our rook from the corner just delivered this checkmate thanks to our sniper bishop from b7 supporting this attack. But the fun part is white is already defenseless. Even if they see this coming, there's nothing they can do. For example, if they play knight to h2, trying to block the h-file for your rook, you then play rook h3, threatening rook takes g3, and that is actually winning the game. For example, if he plays whatever, rook takes g3, pawn takes, queen takes g3, and that is actually a checkmate. And at this point, even Mikhail Tal would say, you know, this dude's got something, like, this dude understands how to attack. Now we know that accepting this knight sacrifice is a losing error for white. And again, theoretically, they can defend here, but it's extremely difficult. There gotta be dodging bullets like Trump, and not many can do that. You have a lot of threats coming here. For example, let's say they do something else. They play d4, you castle queenside. That is another interesting point of your gambit. You're going to castle queenside because that also brings the rook into play and allows you to keep attacking. Now, thanks to the rook on d8, we're still reinforcing, or rather renewing the threat of knight takes d4. So just to show you an idea, if white plays whatever, you can grab this pawn on d4 with either rook or a knight, and in both cases the idea is still the same. If the knight moves, and we are going to eliminate it anyway, we're going to play queen h2 mate. Let's say your opponent noticed the threat and he goes pawn c3 to guard this pawn on e5, then you add more pressure by playing pawn to e5. And our rook is doing a great job, therefore it's also pinning this pawn on d4 to the queen. Still not easy for white to realize what to do about that. In most cases they play pawn d5, but then you play pawn e4 and you win the game once again. The idea is still the same. As soon as we eliminate this knight, queen to h2, checkmate is coming, and white is defenseless. As always, if they trade on g4, temporarily they win a piece, however they open a rook, which also reinforces this queen h2 checkmate idea. And now, for sure, we're going to eliminate this knight. We're attacking it twice, and therefore if he plays something like g3 to block your queen, you then grab it. This pawn is now extremely strong. He certainly cannot tolerate it. If he does that, you'll play something like queen d7 h3 with all kinds of checkmating threats. If he tries to eliminate this pawn and give up material, I mean, you can win anyhow. You can just go knight e5, but if you want to be really fancy, you can play rook takes d5. And you just keep playing brilliant moves all over the place. After queen accepts the sacrifice, you then play knight d4. Knight e4 is a common idea, but here, that is really impressive. Now we attack the queen. If the queen moves, for example, grabs the knight, here comes rook to h1 checkmate. However, if the queen does not move, it has nothing to do really, because we attack the queen, still this rook h1 is coming, and all kinds of knight e2 things are coming, and you're just winning the game. Having said all that, of course, the whole variation remains to be dangerous. After you play queen c7 and allow white to have 2 extra pawns, then yeah, if your attack does not work out, you'll probably lose the game, so there is some risk involved. Therefore, if you want to be more solid, you can stop right here, and instead of sacrificing 2 pawns, you can just stop by sacrificing one of them and simply take the pawn back straight away. Now you're down just 1 pawn, which is not a big deal, honestly, especially if it's an online blitz game, and you get a nice initiative here. They'll usually play knight f3, then play pawn e5, and white is already feeling some pressure because e4 is coming, chasing this knight away. They'll usually play bishop b5, pinning the knight and therefore threatening to capture the pawn. Therefore you defend it by going bishop d6. They castle, you play knight e7 to support this other knight on c6, and temporarily it looks like white has no big problems. But you have this lost in initiative. You're not going to checkmate him straight away or play more solidly, but you have this initiative position overall. Now, they still need to worry about this e4 push, therefore they'll do something about that. Let's say they play rook e1, you castle. Now, this pawn on e5 is guarded twice, therefore white cannot capture it. Let's say they play pawn d3, and at some point we're going to play bishop g4 pinning the knight. And that is actually quite unpleasant. And in all these variations, yes, white is up a pawn, but it's unclear what they can do about that, while you begin mounting pressure. So you put the bishop right here, knight to d4 is coming, you've got this semi-open file for your rook, you start creating threats, and it's not easy for white to figure out what to do. For example, the most played move in this position is pawn h3, which is already a losing error. After this, you trade on f3, and the move that your opponent missed is knight to d4, which is a triple fork to the queen, the bishop, as well as the pawn on c2, and from there we're going to also fork rooks. So you literally fork almost everything in your opponent's position and you win the game. In the next game, white used a slightly different move order, but nevertheless the black setup remains to be the same. White played pawn d3 at this point, blocking you from pushing the pawn forward. We go knight e7, he goes knight c3, we castle, he castles again. At this point, your opponent thinks that he's just up a pawn and you have nothing, but that's a false impression. We still go bishop g4, and that pin remains to be annoying. We're threatening to go knight d4 and add more pressure to this knight. Now, in this position after h3, he's not losing the game because he's got this knight on c3, and therefore taking right here, although possible, I would not recommend that. It's better to just move the bishop back. If you take here, the difference is that after knight to d4, this bishop on b5 is not hanging because it's guarded by his knight, and therefore he can drop the queen back and he saves overall an okay position. Therefore, it is more promising for black. Just maintain the pin and tell him, you know what, you still have to deal with it. Knight d4 is coming, maybe f5 things, stuff like that. Of course, at some point your opponent can decide to just go bold and play g4, but that exposes the king significantly. And then you drop the bishop back. At some point you'll play f5, and the king is going to be vulnerable. You'll certainly have a strong attack there. The most common move by white is knight e4, which is a nice maneuver, generally speaking, positionally speaking. He wants to play knight g3 maybe and kick away your bishop, but that fails to the same tactics that we've seen in the previous example. This knight no longer guards the bishop, and therefore our main tactics works out once again. After knight d4, it's the same triple fork to the bishop and the pawn on c2. What if your opponent decides to play in the most solid way possible, and he does not even try to play bishop b5 at all, he just goes d3 to control these squares straight away? We initially play the same move bishop d6, and after he goes bishop e2, because his setup is so passive, that allows you to be more aggressive. And therefore, instead of just developing your knight somehow, you can push the pawn forward right away, and after he castles, you can then go knight f6. And these two pawns are pretty strong, they control a whole lot of squares. Also, in all the future variations, you'll have the idea e4. It doesn't mean that you have to play straight away, but I will always have to be careful with that idea to attack them. Let's say they go knight c3, a castle. For example, they go bishop g5, and I'll show a variation which is not forced, but just to illustrate how you can develop your attack in the middle game. You can play h6 straight away, or you can develop your light square bishop first. And white is lacking space a little bit. These pieces are slightly awkward. Let's say he goes rook e1, the most played move. You can go h6, chasing this bishop away. They'll have to trade, actually, because in these positions, going back is not an option. You can keep chasing the bishop and ultimately capture it. Therefore, white needs to trade. Now queen takes f6, and it's the similar situation where white is up a pawn theoretically, but that'll be important somewhere down the line in an endgame. But right now, you cannot really feel it, and you have a very active position. You've got more space, 2 bishops, and some attacking ideas. Let's say white goes bishop f1, you can go rook to d8, put in the rook opposite to the queen with some sort of e4 ideas to try to capitalize on that. If white goes queen e2, you can route your bishop to this diagonal once again. White tried really hard to get away from this pin, so therefore you can push it anyway. Let's say they go rook d1, you can go bishop h5. Once again, reinstalling the pin, threatening knight to d4. Even if they move the queen away, you can still play knight to d4 with strong pressure to this knight, to this pawn on c2. From there, we're going to fork the queen and rook. We're still putting pressure down here. He cannot really recapture, because after this, it'll be a double attack here, as well as an attack to his rook. And you can see that overall, you're still creating threats, and it's very hard for white to decide how to defend. If he tries to defend this knight by going bishop e2, then he's missing knight to c2 tactics, and you're again forking his heavy pieces and winning the game. So of course, it's not a forced variation. Your opponent could play something else, but that just illustrates overall how you're going to expand and keep attacking. In general, if you want to know how to avoid any opening disasters and to play opening well consistently in any openings, then check out my free masterclass by clicking the link below the video in the description or somewhere up there, and I'll talk to you in my next videos.